Forget everything you know about assassins. The slick parkour, the shadowy mystique, the deadly elegance. In the brutal grime of medieval life, being an assassin wasn't thrilling. It was a cursed sentence scrawled in blood. Welcome to the true nightmare of the medieval assassin, a job so soul-crushing it made death feel like mercy. Imagine a world where your next breath depends on a lie, your next coin is soaked in betrayal, and your legacy is to be forgotten, not honored. Becoming an assassin wasn't a choice. It was what happened when the world gutted you, tossed you into the gutter, and dared you to crawl out alive. They weren't masters of darkness. They were expendable ghosts, beggars, deserters, outlaws with no one left to bury them. No legend, no training montage, no whispered praises. Only a blade, a name, and the sickening silence after the kill. This was the bottom, not a job, a last resort. No, they wanted the bishop with gold in his teeth, the baron with a moat, the commander with 24 guards. And when you got the job, it wasn't with a contract. It was with a name slid across a table like a death sentence. Hang a cute little sign, quiet eliminations, no questions asked. Congratulations, your corpse will be tomorrow's tavern tale. You didn't get offered power, you were loaned misery, one coin purse at a time. You were a warning. No one taught you how to spot a decoy or slip poison into soup. You found out by failing, and failure was messy, public, and usually final. You were in some mythic ghost slipping past guards. You were a half-starved wreck with cracked boots, waiting to be sliced in half by a suspicious cook or torn apart by a mob, where your only reward was isolation. The only thing you got was trial and error, with error often meaning your own intestines in your lap. You weren't trained. You were forged by desperation and fire. Your boss, a faceless noble. Your contract, a whispered threat. Your reward, maybe a pouch of silver, maybe a noose, set up to remove a political nuisance and pin it on the poor fool with the knife. You'd walk in, blade ready, and suddenly you were surrounded. If you had land, status, or even a goat with a name, you paid someone like this, because the minute you told someone who you were, even accidentally, even over a single mug of ale, your death clock started ticking, if you were lucky. Lottery winning, corpse looting lucky, you had a blade that didn't snap the first time it mattered. Not for the fleas. Not for the guilt. Not for the 3 days spent hiding in a pile of hay soaked in your own fear. If you had nothing to lose, you became one. If you paused to admire your work, it was already too late. You were being tested, to see if you were desperate enough to do it without questions, and stupid enough to trust the people who hired you. Except completion meant risking everything and hoping your client didn't T-skip town or stab you in the gut instead of paying. The stories lie. There was no glory, just rot. Because you weren't hired to kill a drunk. You were sent after men protected by steel, stone, and paranoia. No one chose this life. They were pushed into it. Ex-soldiers with dishonor in their boots, thieves that got too clever, nobodies with a knack for not being seen. Your clients didn't ask you to stab Greg the blacksmith. And oh, you'd better keep your mouth shut. Want to advertise your services? You weren't a man. You didn't train in monasteries under candlelight with kung fu flute music. You learned by stabbing first and running faster. There were no instruction manuals, no orientation. You didn't even get to ask questions. Questions meant hesitation. Hesitation meant death. You didn't carry a sword, you carried shame, dagger rusted from someone else's blood. A garrote, made from stolen twine. You didn't assassinate cleanly. You killed like a panicked animal and ran before the screaming started. There was no guild, no guidance, no graduation. Every kill was a gamble. Still want the job. Let's talk about pay. You were offered silver, half up front, half on completion. That sounded fair, right? You weren't just being paid to kill. And when you survived, if you survived, the pay wasn't enough. Sometimes there was no client at all, just a trap. In the world of medieval assassins, your tongue was more dangerous than your blade. One wrong word, one misstep in the dark, and your head would roll not for what you did, but for what you knew. Every job meant crawling into the enemy's lair, hugging walls that heard more screams than prayers. You didn't knock, you bled your way through. You didn't just walk into danger, you slept in it. No backup, no cover fire, just you. a pair of trembling hands and the sick hope that this time maybe the shadows would protect you. Every cut told a story no one wanted to hear. Every limp, a memory of a job gone sideways. Every breath, a reminder you cheated fate. Again, assassins didn't age. They vanished. If you lived long enough to grow gray, you weren't feared, you were hunted. Retirement wasn't a reward, it was a liability. Your body wasn't just a tool, it was a scar map. You couldn't afford injury. A twisted ankle wasn't inconvenient, it was fatal, because in this job, slow meant dead. You closed your eyes praying the door would stay shut, the poison wouldn't drip, the blade wouldn't slip across your throat in the quiet hour between betrayal and dawn. Sleep was an act of faith. Left no footprints, no scent, only fear. You didn't live in cities, you haunted them, passed through taverns like smoke. How to look at children after you'd choked the life out of their father. Your reflection became your enemy. You changed your face so many times, you forgot the original. Sent you after targets you couldn't even reach without crawling through filth and fire. Who were you before the blades? Before the lies? It didn't matter. That man was gone. A philosopher, a priest, a revolutionary. You didn't wear armor. You wore desperation. Your cloak was threadbare, your boots stolen, your eyes hollowed from staring too long into rooms you'd never escape if things went wrong. You didn't walk into palaces. You infiltrated them. Slipped through kitchens, latrines, catacombs. Places no noble ever thought a ghost could walk, and you killed quickly. Brutally, because hesitation wasn't mercy, it was suicide. The longer your blade stayed out, the closer your lungs came to filling with your own blood. It never trained you to live with the aftermath. No one told you how to wash the fear off your skin. You didn't dream about victory. You dreamed about normal things. A loaf of bread that wasn't stolen, a bed without lice, a day without screams. Your enemies didn't wear armor. They wore robes, sat in towers. Sometimes you were told to kill people you admired, without blinking, without letting your soul twitch. Because empathy, that was a weapon turned inward. But you hoped foolishly that you'd be the exception. You wanted to believe they were guilty, but guilt wasn't your business. Only silence. Every successful kill made you more dangerous and more doomed. The more you proved yourself, the more valuable your elimination became. You weren't just hunted by enemies. You were stalked by memories. The face of that one target who didn't scream, the child who saw you leave the window, the woman who whispered your name, then vanished. Trust wasn't rare. It was extinct. Even your own shadow could betray you if it grew too long. Every city you visited, you counted exits before you breathed. You never sat with your back to the door. You memorized alleyways like others memorize prayers. You learned to kill without looking. You weren't just fighting to live. You were fighting to disappear, to vanish before the guilt caught up. Before the blade meant for someone else found your neck, you were told there was no such thing as an old assassin. Spoiler, you weren't. And even if you survived, what then? You'd never love. Never confess. Never stop looking over your shoulder for a face you forgot to forget. Because in the end, it wasn't the guards or the gallows that got you. It was the quiet, silence that came when you realized. You were the monster. Even when it was real, you couldn't sue anyone. Couldn't say, "Excuse me, Your Honor, I was promised 10 silver and a pardon." The only court UDC was the one that sentenced you to death for crimes no one would admit to commissioning. So you adapted. You demanded everything up front. You had whatever you could fit under your robe without making a noise. A knife, a rope, maybe a nail. That was it. Sometimes you drank it. There was no science, only superstition. No retries. Your target, someone who didn't sleep in the same bed twice and kept a dagger under their pillow and a priest at the door. Alone, hungry, dying, and still expected to perform. Miracles. No backup, no handler whispering advice from the rafters. You had your nerves and a blade you prayed didn't betray you. Improvise your weapon broke mid-job, you improvised. You didn't drink with the crew. You sat in the darkest corner, back to the wall, eyes on the door, too scared to sleep, because sleep was vulnerability. You were sent after the elite. They were protected like cursed treasure. Guards. Everywhere. Walls. Impenetrable. Staff. Always watching. A tile from a roof. A belt buckle. A spoon. Trusted no one. Not the drunk with a parchment. Not the girl with a smile. It's not even the shadow behind you. Because in this world, the only promise was betrayal. There were no wrist blades or enchanted arrows, no gadgets. Poison, sure. If you liked Russian roulette with soup, sometimes it worked. Sometimes it gave your target indigestion and made them more paranoid than before. No safety net, because in the end it wasn't the tool that killed, it was you. You didn't kill nobodies. Castles weren't buildings, they were nightmares. Moats, murder holes, boiling oil, and inside, and if by some miracle you made it in, disguised as a monk or a chambermaid, then you had to act. Hold a chamber pot, mumble a prayer, lie, smile, blend, fail at any of it, and you were stabbed, hanged, or worse, questioned. Not sleek black robes, but rags, stolen boots, a moldy hood. You smelled like desperation and war guilt like armor. One mistake, one wrong nod, and you became tomorrow's execution. You were just a shadow wrapped in lies, and shadows don't last long in daylight. Even your disguise was a joke. If someone saw through it, even a dog, it was over. You had no team. Every contact was a risk. Every ally was a potential executioner. Even fellow thieves avoided you. You weren't a man anymore. You were a ghost, cursed to walk among the living, pretending to smile, pretending to forget, always watching, always hunted. And that was before the kill. So you did it. You actually did it. The blade struck true. The noble fell. No screams, no guards, just silence. And a corpse whose death would echo through kingdoms. But this wasn't victory. This wasn't glory. This was the beginning of your nightmare. Because once the job was done, you weren't a hero. You were a loose end. Your first breath after the kill wasn't relief. It was terror. You weren't thinking about payment. You were thinking about escape. Because the second your dagger found its mark, 100 blades turned toward you, and every one wanted your blood. No rooftop wine, no slow walk into the sunset, just blood on your boots and hell at your heels. Back alleys, bolted doors, disguises that didn't fit. Everything became a race against time. You had to vanish before your name became legend. Because legends don't survive, they burn. And your client, if they were smart, they ran. If they were ruthless, they sent someone after you. Because now you were dangerous. Now you knew things. Now you had leverage. Didn't leave a calling card. You left a trail of fear, of silence, of people too afraid to whisper your name. Every locked gate. Not now. You're a walking liability. A shadow with a heartbeat. It's the kind of mistake that could talk. Every checkpoint. Every rusted horseshoe. Every sneering guard with an urgent sketch and a bad attitude. All of them could end you. You were being hunted by the very city you just saved from tyranny. And no one cared. Even if the deal had been real, even if they promised to pay, they wouldn't to meet you in a tavern. So even in success, you were alone. A future that didn't exist. A monk, a gardener, a mute, anything but what you were. Burned your clothes, swallowed your name. That you stirred poison with a frog's toe under a blood moon. That you breathed death through walls and vanished when baptized. Worse than alone, you were a target. And what did you get for it? A pouch of coins you couldn't spend? Name you couldn't say, so you shaved your beard and ran? You told people you were Brother Lucian. Because in this twisted world, people didn't just fear you. Because to succeed meant starting over. Again and again and again. You were a problem to solve with fire. Because if you were remembered, you were doomed. And if the assassin's life wasn't already miserable, poor, hunted, cursed, it was about to get worse. They hated you. They believed you were cursed. To them, you weren't a man. You were a monster with a whisper for a soul. Mushrooms, minerals, roots, and hope. You eyeballed. Sometimes they killed. Sometimes they just gave your target a stomachache and a burning hatred for soup. Peasants thought you made pacts with demons. You were the horror behind every shadow. The reason the crops failed, the cause of their baby's fever. Even your blade wasn't steel. To them, it was witchcraft. You were blamed for every choking, every sickness, every bad dream, and superstition doesn't negotiate. It burns. Villages turned to mobs, torches in one hand, pitchforks in the other. You weren't a person. You couldn't settle. You couldn't linger. Even a foreign accent could get you dragged into the square. Your only prayer was to stay forgotten. And what about poison, that elegant killer? The whispered death, another lie. Poisons in the Middle Ages weren't silent daggers. They were roulette wheels. You didn't have labs. You had guesswork. You didn't dose. A pinch too little, they walked away. Pinch too much, you died first. Even getting poison into food was a nightmare. You couldn't just walk into the castle kitchen and stir your brew into the stew. Meals passed through tasters, priests, dogs, and paranoia. And if it worked, if by some unholy miracle your mark took the poison bite, you still had to wait. Minutes, hours, days. You stood there pretending to polish goblets while watching for a cough, a stumble, a final breath. And if they survived, guess who got blamed? Not the cook. Not the priest. You, the man with the twitchy eyes and the herbal bag. With tools. You wouldn't die quickly. You'd confess to poisoning everyone, even the dog. And being caught didn't mean execution. It meant interrogation. But even if you killed successfully, you weren't remembered. You were erased. You could change the course of history. Kill a tyrant, end a war, stop a bloodline, and still your name would vanish in the smoke. You weren't a hero. You weren't even a villain. You were a whisper, a rumor. The man who never finished his ale? The foreigner who always sat with his back to the wall? The ghost who killed and disappeared? That was the point. You didn't get remembered. You got removed. You didn't get a statue. You got an unmarked grave, if you were lucky. If not, your head ended up on a spike, labeled traitor. Sometimes they remembered your name just so they could curse it. A warning to children. Don't cross the king. Remember what happened to Ulrich? And the man who did it, gone, like a ghost. Your legacy wasn't glory, it was absence. You lived in the space between stories. The name no one dared to say. And even if you got paid, even if the client honored the deal, it didn't matter, because they would never trust you. And in this job, trust was suicide. The client who smiled at you today might put a blade in your ribs tomorrow. You were a threat, a liability, a living secret that couldn't be controlled. One assassin to kill, another to kill the killer. So even in success, you weren't safe. You were just next. Some clients even double-booked. But you still had to assume they were watching. Always efficient, clean, final, try blackmail, try leverage. You wouldn't live long enough to try again, because powerful people didn't debate with assassins, they buried them. If you were lucky, if your client had a sliver of honor left in their blood, they'd leave you alone. Their swords were sharpening, and you were still breathing, a problem yet to be solved. They didn't hire you out of respect. No pension, no cottage, no peace. They hired you because they needed something awful done, and you were the only tool sharp enough to do it. Once done, you weren't a weapon anymore. You were the liability. Sell herbs. So maybe, maybe you ran, maybe you walked away. Too many names, too much blood, no one wanted you alive. Maybe you tried to retire. Bad idea, because medieval assassins didn't get retirement plans. You didn't fade. You vanished, or you died. Often both. Too many secrets. You could change your name, move to a village, pretend to be a gardener, fake a limp. You still couldn't sleep. Every knock made you flinch. Every eye on the street made your hand twitch toward your blade. You didn't dream anymore. Dreams were a luxury for people with futures. You stopped laughing, stopped loving. You became a ghost in a man's skin. Because the truth was simple. There was no end game. There's no happy ending. No redemption arc. There was only distance, darkness, and a slow, quiet fade. Until one day, you just disappeared. No story, no legacy, no grave, just silence. And maybe, just maybe, that was the best ending you could hope for. The real terror begins after the body hits the floor. That's when the world starts looking for you. And suddenly, every open window becomes a sniper's nest. You weren't a celebrated warrior. You were the disease nobody dared name. And after the kill, your scent was everywhere. On the coins, on the walls, in the air. And the city began to suffocate from the stench of what you'd done. You didn't flee, you evaporated. One heartbeat you existed. The next you were wind. Every knock at a door, a death sentence written in urgency. But no matter how fast you moved, paranoia moved faster. Every footstep behind you was a blade unsheathed. You didn't run from guards. You ran from betrayal. Because betrayal wasn't an if, it was a when. There was no safe house, no sanctuary. Just unfamiliar walls closing in around you like a coffin built from bad decisions. Your clients stopped being your employer the moment you succeeded. Now, they were just another person with a reason to erase you. You were a story told in trembling whispers and shaking hands. You tried to vanish into the crowd, but your face burned in every torchlit mind. Every eye watches. Every whisper could be the one that ends your life. You weren't a man anymore. Ever tried to hide in a city that hates you? Every door slams. You say payment is the final act. But for you, it's a trap. A final rendezvous soaked in risk where the coin purse might be real or it might contain a blade aimed at your throat. If the client feared you'd talk, they didn't wait for you to start. They acted quietly, cleanly, sometimes with a hired killer better fed than you. You were a piece in a game you didn't design, and every move brought you closer to checkmate. You stopped eating hot meals. Heat meant comfort. Comfort meant you'd let your guard down. And that food meant vulnerability. That meant death. You never kept tokens. No souvenirs, no trophies. Because even a scrap of memory could be used to trace you back. Sometimes you killed, just to disappear again, to burn your past in another's blood, to vanish before the truth caught up to you with claws and a grin. You started muttering in your sleep, calling names you never meant to remember, screaming for mercy you knew would never come. You told yourself it was worth it, that you were buying freedom, but every coin burned. Every step away from the job felt like walking into quicksand. That power meant nothing in the face of silence and steel. And if someone did recognize you, an old lover, a street merchant, a child, you only had two options, run or erase. Your fingerprints became curses, your name a plague. You couldn't love, couldn't write, couldn't exist. You saw your own wanted posters, crude drawings, ridiculous eyes. But they always got one thing right, the emptiness. People feared what you represented, the reminder that anyone, anywhere, could fall. Your legacy was paranoia. Even the innocent started looking over their shoulders. Even the righteous started checking their beds. And still, you kept moving. City to city, lie to lie, trying to outrun the stench of who you'd become. But it always followed, because the assassin's curse is simple. You never outrun your own shadow. And eventually, even the darkness turns its back. And when that day comes, when the silence gets louder than your footsteps, you'll realize you're not being hunted anymore, because you're already forgotten. Before she was feared, before she was reviled, before history tried to erase her with the same hand it used to crown her son, she was a girl named Myrtle. But Myrtle was not born to be docile. She danced not with ribbons, but with serpents. She worshipped not with hymns, but with trance. And she did not bow to gods. She called them down. In a world of warlords and drunken kings, she was the thunder in the storm's heart, the storm that would give birth to Alexander the Great. They called her Olympias. She didn't rule with armies. She ruled with prophecy. She ruled with vengeance. She ruled with fear. Her people claimed she descended from Achilles. Whether it was myth or madness didn't matter, because everyone who met her either bowed, or bled. In a time when women were meant to be background shadows, she made herself into a divine omen. She didn't decorate palaces. She didn't play the harp. She whispered to gods, danced in moonlight, and let snakes crawl across her skin like scepters. To her allies, she was sacred. To her enemies, she was cursed. And then came Philip. A brutal king, sharp as steel, horny as hell, dangerous in both. He came to Samothrace for a holy rite. He left with a woman he would never control. Their marriage wasn't a fairy tale. It was prophecy crashing headfirst into power. Lightning struck on their wedding night. Flames danced in dreams. And in Olympias's womb a storm gathered, a child not ordinary, not mortal, Alexander. The boy she would raise not as a son, but as a god. But the palace was never safe, especially not for women who refused to kneel. Philip was a king of many beds, and Olympias didn't take kindly to betrayal. When Philip married a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, he wasn't just cheating, he was challenging the bloodline, challenging her child. At the wedding, an insult was thrown. Alexander's legitimacy questioned. Olympias's fury ignited. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she disappeared. Back to Epirus, where her roots ran deep and her influence ran deeper. She wasn't retreating, she was coiling. And then, as if fate herself was her accomplice, Philip was assassinated. At a wedding, blade, a fall, a kingdom shaken. No one knew who did it, but everyone looked at Olympias, and no one had the courage to accuse her, not aloud. Because within days, Cleopatra and her newborn child were dead. Some say Olympias made Cleopatra hang herself, after forcing her to watch her infant daughter murdered. Others say the baby was tossed onto a burning pyre. One thing is certain, Mercy died that day, Olympias. She ruled that funeral like a goddess in judgment. Now her son was king. No opposition, no rivals, no doubt. And behind his coronation, her voice, her hands, her will, she whispered to generals. She made nobles vanish. She burned threats before they had names. Alexander the Great was not just the result of conquest. He was engineered by Olympias. He didn't always approve of her violence, but he never stopped her, because he knew she was right. Power demands blood, and his path to empire had been soaked in it, by the woman who gave him life. When Alexander marched east, the world watched a young man become a legend. But behind him, back in Macedon, was a woman with teeth sharper than any sword, a mother, a queen. A threat. Her official title was Queen Mother, but her true role, the spine of the empire. She wrote to Alexander, constantly. Her letters weren't maternal, they were warnings. They were commands. They were divine whispers dressed as advice. She questioned his loyalty, scolded his obsession with Persian women, warned him about his generals, told him who to trust, and who to eliminate. No one else could speak to Alexander like this. No one else dared. But Olympias didn't fear kings. She made them. Back home, Antipater, the regent, began to resent her. But he couldn't move against her. It's not openly. Because Olympias had roots in Epirus, in Thessaly, in blood, and in faith. She stirred rebellion with a whisper. She made men question with a glance. She wasn't just a queen. She was a myth in motion. But when Alexander began drifting, chasing Persian glory, marrying foreign queens, declaring divinity, she grew restless. She saw cracks in the empire. And behind each crack, she saw betrayal. And then Alexander died. Babylon. 323 BCE. The storm she raised was gone, and in its place, a fractured empire. Generals with ambitions, no clear heir, no order. To Olympias, this wasn't grief, it was war, and her weapon. Alexander's son, a baby boy born to Roxana, the last true blood of the divine. She allied with Roxana, promised to protect the child, but also to use him. Because blood wasn't just legacy, it was leverage. But the world had changed. The generals weren't just soldiers anymore. They were kings in waiting, and none of them cared for the old queen. Iskander, the son of her enemy, rose with cold fire in his veins. He wanted Olympias erased, forgotten, but she didn't flinch. She'd fought kings, killed queens, raised gods. She didn't need approval. She needed vengeance. And so, years after Alexander's death, she returned. Not as a widow, not as a mother, as a storm. With Polyperchon's backing and an army at her heels, she swept into Macedon like a reckoning. Towns opened their gates. Soldiers defected. Her name was still power. And then came the blood. Philip III, a puppet king, his wife a rival, both executed. With ceremony, with message, Olympias didn't hide her wrath. She crowned it. she declared only the bloodline of Alexander would rule. Everyone else? Pretenders. For a brief shining moment, she held the kingdom in her claws. She was no longer the serpent behind the curtain. She was the throne. But power in Macedon burns hot and fast. Cassandra returned. With numbers, with strategy, with rage. And the tide turned. Her allies disappeared. Polyperchon faded. Olympias, once untouchable, was now surrounded. Trapped in the fortress of Pydna, besieged, starving, waiting, but she didn't beg. She didn't cry. She stood, regal, silent, a queen, until the last. Cassandra hesitated. Killing Olympias, even now, felt like blasphemy. She still carried myth-like armor, so he offered her mercy, surrender and live. She knew better. She'd seen too many promises turn to ash. Still, hunger wasn't a choice anymore. It was death. Her fortress broke, her followers surrendered, and Olympias handed to her enemies. Cassandra didn't kill her. He let the families of her victims decide. And they condemned her to death. But when the time came, no one would strike the first blow. She stood, eyes cold as prophecy, and not one man dared raise the sword, because they had all grown up hearing her name, seeing her son as a god. And now they faced the storm's mother. Finally, Cassandra sent outsiders. Men who didn't know what she had been, only what she was now. A problem to be erased. And with steel and silence, they ended her. Not with glory, not with ceremony, with fear. Her death marked the end of Alexander's line, and with it, the final ember of his empire flickered out. But her shadow, it didn't vanish, it coiled. She didn't walk into history. She carved her name into it with bloodied fingernails. Olympias wasn't born to be remembered. She was born to be feared. She wasn't a queen because of lineage. She was a queen because the gods were too afraid to deny her. Other women learned to serve. She learned to summon. Snakes coiled at her feet. Oracles bowed when she entered. Her stare could curdle milk and silence thunder. People didn't worship her. They survived her. She didn't marry Philip for love, and everyone knew it wouldn't end peacefully. She married him to infiltrate power like poison in wine. That wedding wasn't sacred. It was a transaction, a storm marrying a blade. On the night Alexander was conceived, it was said thunder struck the palace. The gods themselves trembled, because what had been created was no mortal child. Olympias didn't raise a boy. She raised a weapon, a living vengeance. That fear was a tool, not a prison, a divine fury in the shape of a prince. While others gave lullabies, she whispered prophecy into Alexander's ear, told him the world was his, that gods would kneel. She wasn't motherly, she was mythic, every gesture calculated, every word sharpened to a blade. When Philip turned his eye to another woman, Olympias didn't cry. She sharpened her silence into steel, and let the world feel her wrath in whispers. With revenge, with a grin that made men cross themselves. When her rivals birthed children, she didn't just retaliate. She erased bloodlines, snuffed out heirs like candle flames. She didn't assassinate Cleopatra Eurydice. She dismantled her with ritual. It was a coronation of vengeance passed from mother to son. After Philip's death, the air around her turned colder, because the throne was no longer behind her, and waited, it was beneath her. When Alexander took power, it wasn't a victory. Every general feared him, but they obeyed her. Goes where Alexander conquered with swords, Olympias conquered with silence. Her letters weren't correspondence. They were commands written in divine ink. Alexander never dared cross her, not fully, but she had what none of them did. Because even emperors fear the woman who made them. When he drifted east, tangled in Persian politics and new gods, she watched. Because even if his heart wandered, his throne still bled Macedonian. And when Alexander died, Olympias didn't mourn. She calculated, eyes dry, voice steady, because grief is for mortals, and she had no time for sorrow. The generals squabbled. The empire cracked. The bloodline. The boy. The last flame. She wasn't preserving her legacy. She was planning her return. A prophecy, a goddess in the shape of a woman. When she marched back into Macedon, it wasn't a rebellion. It was a reckoning. The earth trembled not from armies, but from memory. Every head she claimed wasn't just vengeance. It was ritual. Philip III, a sacrifice. his wife, cleansing. Olympias didn't just rule, she haunted. She became the story mothers whispered to unruly daughters, a warning, too dangerous to forget. Olympias died not with a crown on her head, but with dirt under her feet, unarmed, alone, hunted, her bloodline extinguished, her legacy burned, her bones swallowed by time. But history isn't fair. It doesn't always crown the conquerors. Sometimes it remembers the cursed, and Olympias. She was never built for silence. She wasn't a footnote. She was a fire. A mother who forged a god with her own rage. And when she died, the world didn't breathe. It winced. Because no one forgets a queen who whispers to snakes and crowns herself in prophecy. But history did something strange. It buried her power and elevated her whispers. Not to glorify her, but to contain her. Because Olympias didn't just make history. She weaponized it. And that's the thing about women like her. You can kill them, but you can't unwrite them. The Serpent Queen had fallen, but her shadow lingered. And it still coils in every tale of blood, empire, and mothers with teeth. She had ruled not with a throne, but with venom, and her venom still stings. But while the world burned her memory, another world, older, stranger, deeper, lay waiting. A palace buried in dust, a myth carved in stone, a question no one could answer. On the sun-blasted island of Crete stood Nasus, a ruin with no straight lines, a maze that swallowed time, the whispered origin of the labyrinth itself. This wasn't fiction, this wasn't fantasy, this was a riddle wrapped in walls. Nasus wasn't just a palace, it was a civilization wearing a mask of myth. Rooms spiraled, corridors vanished, stairs led nowhere, and everywhere. Horns, bulls, symbols, snakes. It felt more alive than dead, as if the stones were holding their breath, as if the past was watching you. Long before the Greeks sharpened their spears, before Alexander rode east, before Olympias crowned her son beneath thunder. The Minoans ruled here, but they ruled with elegance, not iron. No vast armies, no screaming conquests. Just silence, sea trade, and a palace so sophisticated it could flush your sins down a pipe. Literally. Nasus had light wells, air shafts, multi-story apartments, flush toilets, and a system of organization so advanced it made later empires look like children playing in the dirt. This wasn't a city, it was a living god. But the deeper you walked, the more the walls whispered. Because here, in this maze of bulls and shadows, a myth was born. The Minotaur, half man, half beast, all terror. Locked in a labyrinth so twisted no one could escape. But what if the monster was real, not of flesh but of memory? King Minos, tribute from Athens. 7 boys, 7 girls, fed to the beast beneath the palace. Or was the monster just a metaphor? A memory of Minoan dominance? Of fear wrapped in ritual? 'Cause the bull wasn't just an animal here, it was sacred. And the palace, it wasn't a prison. It was a sermon in stone, a labyrinth not to trap beasts, but to invoke the divine. The Minoans didn't worship gods in temples. They built gods into their homes. They carved horns into rooftops, placed snake goddesses in storerooms, painted dolphin dancers on bathtubs, vaulted over bulls like acrobats in a sacred theater of death and rebirth. This wasn't just art, it was power. It was the belief that ritual could bend reality, that a woman with serpents in her hands could hold life itself. And in the very heart of this maze, the so-called throne room, sat no king, only a seat, empty, guarded by griffins, surrounded by silence. Was it a throne for a priestess, a goddess, or no one? No one knows. Because the Minoans left no voice behind. Their script, linear A, remains unreadable, their thoughts buried. We don't know what they prayed for, or who they feared. Only that they built a world that shimmered, then vanished. But not in fire, not in war, in quiet. No blood, no mass graves, just a soft fade, as if the island sighed and let go. Some blame a volcano, the eruption of Thera, a blast that may have shattered their economy and broken their gods. Others point to invasion, the Mycenaeans from the Greek mainland, absorbing what was left, rewriting it in their image. Suddenly the bulls weren't sacred, they were slain, the priestesses vanished, and the labyrinth became a prison, not a temple. What had been divine was now dangerous. But even in ruin, Gnosis didn't stop breathing. Centuries later, a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans unearthed the palace. And what he found didn't just rewrite history, it resurrected a myth. He saw the walls, the symbols, the rooms that led nowhere, and he said, "This is the labyrinth," called the people Minoans. He rebuilt sections. He imagined colors and meanings. And for the first time in 3,000 years, the palace spoke again. Not in facts, but in feeling, in patterns, in fragments, in questions. Because maybe the labyrinth wasn't a maze. Maybe it was a mirror, a reflection of the world inside us, chaotic, sacred, terrifying. The Minotaur wasn't just a beast. It was the thing we feared in ourselves. And Theseus, the hero with the thread. He wasn't just a warrior. He was us. He's trying to escape our own darkness. Gnosis didn't crumble. It transformed. It became a story. Stories don't die. They mutate. Thousands of years later, we still wander those halls, still ask the same questions, still feel that chill behind the door. Because it's not the monsters we fear. It's the silence that follows. Gnosis reminds us. You can build a palace that touches the gods. You can paint your walls with dolphins and sunlit joy. But time eats everything. It doesn't roar. It doesn't burn. It just waits. And when it's done, all that's left is shadow, an echo, and stone. So what do we learn from a cursed assassin, a vengeful queen, a monster in a maze? That power is fleeting. The memory is fragile. That silence isn't peace. It's the price. Because the assassin who changed history was forgotten. The queen who crowned a god died unnamed. And the civilization that mastered the sea now lies beneath dust and questions. And the world keeps turning. Still sharp, still cruel, still swallowing legends before they learn to speak. So remember this. You may kill a king. You may raise an empire. You may build a labyrinth so sacred it bends the stars. But in the end, you will be forgotten, unless the shadows choose to remember. What happens after legends die? They rot. They whisper. They twist into shadows so ancient that even time forgets where the scream started. Olympias didn't simply perish. She was extinguished like a dangerous flame. A warning to future women who dared burn too bright. Her execution wasn't about justice. It was about fear. It was fear of what she still represented, even unarmed, even alone. Even her silence terrified them. Because when a woman who once made kings kneel says nothing, the earth itself listens. She died on her feet. No tears, no screams. Only the quiet fury of someone who knew she deserved more than death. She deserved legend. The sword took her life, but it couldn't take her memory. Cassander thought he'd buried her, but instead he ignited a curse that would echo through every blood-stained throne in Macedonian history. Her story wasn't forgotten. It was locked, buried, feared. The ashes of her bones whispered beneath palaces, reminding every royal child that power comes with a price. And while the world turned its back on her, another ruin opened its arms. Gnosis. In Gnosis, time wasn't linear. It looped. Twisting corridors. Painted gods. Walls that seemed to breathe. You didn't explore Gnosis. You entered it. Came out changed. The Minotaur was more than myth. He was the echo of a civilization that dared to challenge the divine, and lost. The Minoans didn't build palaces. They built spells in stone. A labyrinth that mocked logic and dared sanity to follow. And at the heart of this maze, a throne, but no king. Just a void that once held something holy or monstrous. Olympias would have understood Gnosis. It's because, like her, it was elegant on the surface and terrifying underneath. The palace wasn't dead. It was waiting. A sacrifice, a soul brave enough to listen. For a name. The symbols carved into the walls weren't decoration, they were warnings. Maps to a place you should never reach. The Minotaur didn't guard the labyrinth. The labyrinth was the Minotaur. Its teeth were doors, its heartbeat, the echo of sandals across cold stone. And every step deeper was a journey inward, into fear, into memory, into yourself, Linear. Their lost language remains unsolved, because maybe we were never meant to read it. But it wasn't nature's wrath. It was the gods closing the book on a story we weren't supposed to read. Maybe understanding it unleashes it. The Minoans vanished, not with blood, but with a silence so loud it made future empires shiver. Thera exploded, and the sky darkened. And now, centuries later, we walk among the ruins, pretending we're scholars. But we're not decoding history. We're poking a slumbering beast, because the real terror isn't that these empires ended, it's that they're still watching. Through dust, through stone, through every story we tell. To forget the truth hiding beneath.